Welcome, dear colleagues and friends, to this last day of this extraordinary conference. And many thanks to the World Academy for this meaningful way of celebrating its 65th anniversary by reaffirming once again its commitment to addressing the pressing challenges confronting humanity today, independent of political boundaries or limits. Dear colleagues, this particular panel examines a profound philosophical question, which bears directly on how we show up in the midst of the current polycrisis. As you know, the World Academy upholds a transdisciplinary approach in its forums. And today, once again, rather than focusing on particular facets of history, we aim to establish the links between historical trends and current turbulence. Even as societal and environmental erosion looms larger and larger before our eyes, we aim to take a higher level perspective on what appears to be a haphazard zigzag pattern of progress and retreat. Our goal is to take a close look at progress narratives and civilizational learning and to understand if we can discern a greater historical direction beyond the turbulence of this moment for global society. Can we come to an understanding which can temper the growing confusion and despair resulting from the recent retreat? And can we help shift our focus to how we can complete the progress to the next stage of social evolution, which meets with resistance, as we know, at this point in time? From my evolutionary social science perspective, growth and transformation processes in both individual and collective development are typically painstaking and often quite turbulent, involving two parallel and seemingly mutually contradictory tendencies. One is the deepening untenability of an old worldview, which causes it to retreat into a defensive stance. The other is the arduous emergence of a new level of understanding, which embraces earlier levels into a more comprehensive, more fully integrated and adaptive system. Of course, this process is extremely difficult, as I just mentioned, arduous, both in individual and in the collective development of consciousness, which has been my focus of study for many years. And nonetheless, as you can tell from these initial comments, from both the scientific and a spiritual perspective, I tend to see social evolution even in the darkest historical moments. I believe that the spiritual history of humanity is full of examples of how it becomes darkest just before the dawn of a new level of collective understanding. And so, dear colleagues, let us now turn to our keynote speaker, an expert historian and founder of History Without Borders, Professor Erkki TUOMIOJA.
Thank you very much for the invitation to address this session on Does History Have a Direction?
Is former Minister of Affairs in Finland, and I am sure you'll agree. Just,
Sorry,
I was just going to finish your introduction.
Okay.
We have a little interruption in the connection. So I just wanted to add that Mr. TUOMIOJA is not just the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland, but as I'm sure you will agree with me, it takes an enlightened society to appoint a historian as minister. That is no small token of Finland. So, Mr. TUOMIOJA, what can you tell us about the historical patterns you discern, and what do you believe they point to?
Thank you very much. One of the most well-known attempts to give history a direction was the book The End of History by Francis Fukuyama in 1989, where he argued that history should be viewed as an evolutionary process and that the end of history in this sense means that liberal democracy is the final form of government for all nations. This is, of course, a simplified summary of Fukuyama's message, and he was wise enough to complete the title of his book with a question mark, which subsequent events have amply justified. In my view, history can never be written in such a way that it will not always leave it open to re-evaluation, and interpretations of history and long cycles should also be approached with caution. And we can recall Zhou Enlai's answer to President Nixon when he asked his Chinese host in 1972 what the significance of the French Revolution was. It was too early to say, was the answer, although it has since been surmised that the questioner and the respondent may have had in mind the 1968 student revolution in Paris. Nevertheless, I will attempt to identify some of the long-term cycles that influence our views of history. And population growth needs to be mentioned first. Humans as a species are less than 500,000 years old, but 6,000 years ago, there were not even 10 million people in the world. And at the beginning of our era, there were no more than 170 million of us in the whole world. The 1 billion mark was not crossed until the early 19th century, and the 2 billion mark in the 1920s. And at the end of World War II, the number was 2.3 billion, after which it has more than quadrupled in the past 8 years to the current 8.2 billion. And this population growth is the main reason why we live in a world of increasing interdependence in a way which will come to dominate the way we understand and interpret history. And one obvious conclusion is that we can have no historical knowledge or experience on the one hand of how the relationships between people and the communities, nations and states they form will be organized in a world of increasing interdependence inhabited by such a large population, nor, on the other, how this number of people will affect how we organize our relationship with the natural environment. Since the Industrial Revolution, humankind has developed increasingly efficient ways of extracting natural resources from our environment, transforming them into products for our use, and in doing so, leaving an ever-increasing amount of waste, emissions, and toxins in the environment. And we have only recently become aware of the unsustainability of this development. Now, in the best case scenario, we may have at most a few decades to adapt all human activities on Earth to the requirement of ecologically, socially, and economically sustainable development. Can we do this? Our answer would only a few decades ago have been more certain about a positive answer than today. Optimistic belief in the future has now mostly eroded. We are living in times where we no longer share the belief that tomorrow will inevitably be better than yesterday. And if one, as a historian, tries to see what is going on in a sufficiently long arc, one can say that this is the story about the rise and decline of the belief in progress. This belief in progress, the idea that the course of history is inexorably moving towards better times, began to replace the static or cyclical concept of time and became dominant at the beginning of the so-called modern era. It is especially associated with the breakthrough of the Enlightenment philosophy of the 18th century. And the belief in progress was not a uniform idea, and it believed in a better future could be shared by both Adam Smith and Karl Marx, as well as later liberals, capitalists, and communists. They differed, of course, on what this better future entailed and how it could be brought about, but they shared a belief in progress as such. And the decline in belief in progress is not directly related to how the world has developed, and it is not explained by the perception that the world has become worse or more dangerous. Indeed, there are significant items where we see undeniable progress worldwide, such as, for example, falling infant mortality, lengthening life expectancy, and how the probability of famine has receded. But at the same time, our uncertainty about what the future entails has grown. This belief in progress is therefore also multidimensional. There have always been doomsday prophets preaching about the coming end of the world, but in our time, the global consequences of population growth, climate change, and weapons of mass destruction have made it possible to present quite plausible scientific scenarios for how life on Earth can end than those which in history have been based solely on divine revelation. And there is also the cultural pessimism expressed by Otto Spengler 100 years ago in his Decline of the West. And this is also linked to the postmodernist view of the great end of great narrative. It is actually located somewhere in between belief in progress and predictions of doomsday, as there is no narrative greater than the end of the world. We should not overlook path dependency as a constraint on human choices. And with this, I refer to the idea that the system's current state and future outcomes are heavily influenced by its past decisions and events, making it difficult to change course even if a different path might be more beneficial. Essentially, past choices create a path that limits future possibilities. But even a close analysis of path dependency, as useful and important as it is, cannot give us any certain knowledge about whether the world is going for the better or for the worse, or whether even it's going to destroy itself. Living in such a world of uncertainty is not easy. However, it does not have to and must not mean surrendering to hopelessness and despair. And could history be an antidote to this hopelessness and despair? One consequence of the lack of history in our time, that is, the weakening awareness and understanding of how we have come to where we are today, is that this lack of awareness also makes it more difficult to see and take control of the future. It also feeds the short-sightedness of post-modernity, here and now thinking, and increases the chances of becoming prisoners of history and historical myths and tools for the aspirations of politicians who abuse it. History has made us into what we are, but we should not be satisfied with remaining passive victims of history, but take on the role of active makers of history. And just to sum up, I would say that yes, I think that there is a growing awareness. Perhaps the majority of the people are aware that they cannot continue with business as usual. But can we overcome the path dependency, which makes it very difficult to make a clean break with this path? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a powerful entry into this topic. And of course, you've helped us really appreciate the soft power of historical understanding. How we understand history really influences how we see the path forward. So you leave us with a very powerful reminder that the weakening of historical understanding in our current here and now consumer society has led to short-term thinking and decision-making, through which we become, as you say, prisoners of history. But now that we've heard your very thoughtful remarks on the long cycles that influence our view of history, such as population growth and the complexity of global organization it requires, and the only very recent scientific learning about sustainability, as well as the vacillations of beliefs about progress, which we will come back to again later in this discussion, I would like to invite each of our panelists to take 5 minutes to comment on this pivotal question, which is Do we see history as guided by forces which follow a discernible direction or as unfolding chaotically? I would like to offer a way for us to keep time of this important conversation so that we can have a second round. If you are okay with this, when after 4 minutes, I will give you a signal that you've got 1 minute remaining so that you can wrap up your initial comments, and then hopefully we can really have a second round of more in-depth discussion. So the question once again is, do we see history as guided by forces which follow a discernible direction or as unfolding chaotically? We turn now to the president of the World Academy, Garry Jacobs. And so Garry, from the perspective of your lifetime of service to social development and global governance, what do you consider important for people to understand about the evolutionary trajectory of history, especially at a time when civilization appears to be eroding?
Elena, thank you very much. First, for agreeing to moderate this session. And Erkki, I'd like to thank you for coming and welcome you to the Academy. I was very glad that we could get you as a keynote speaker at the beginning of the session. Elena, my actual plan was to be the last speaker in this. I asked this question, I formulated the idea of this session because I really wanted to hear from other people and how they're thinking about this, because I think the answer to this question will determine our view of the future and what's going on now. And therefore, I'm almost hesitant to tell you my views up front, but since you asked me to, I will, with brevity. I think that is a very important question for us now. And just as for full disclosure, my own thoughts on the subject has been strongly influenced by my study of Sri Aurobindo, who definitely has an evolutionary perspective on the evolution of humanity and the evolution of society. But I'd like to look at it in the context that we're grappling with it in the Academy today. Most of the history we look at focuses on, as Erkki said, he spoke about the quantitative increase in population from 10 million, about 10,000, 10 millennium ago. And we see the quantitative increase, which we know now from demographers will change after a while and will probably start going in the other direction on population, but that's been very noticeable. We also see unquestionably a movement from local and isolated communities and individuals to what is now more and more, if not fully, a global community for the first time in history, as far as we can track back to it. As a direction. And we not only see it in terms of the movement of people and the interaction of people, but the growth of institutions from local, isolated, and the growth of cultures to more and more interacting, more and more growing through the complexity of that interaction, more and more an exchange of ideas, exchange of beliefs, and exchange of values. And I guess the real significance of the question for me with reference to global turbulence is, are we, as Ketan suggested in, I think, his opening remarks, are we really at a point of transition in global civilization? And if that's true, it's a very important question for us to understand what that might mean and what are the significance of it. And incidentally, Francis Fukuyama is a fellow of the Academy. He was elected about 30 years ago. And I think we don't want to make the mistake of assuming that we have found a formula that's suddenly going to realize itself. It was a humbling experience for the Western world, not just for a historian, to realize that our view of the world was quite narrow at that time, and to assume that it was going to go in a particular linear fashion. And I think we should not make that mistake today. Another thing we shouldn't mistake is we see in history a continuous pattern of rapid advances followed by at least partial retreats. So that it's hard when you follow history up close, it's hard to know whether we're going forward or back, or whether that was really a progress, or it was an accident that's going to be reversed and never followed up again. So it's not history, the record of history is not very easy to decipher, even in retrospect, to draw clear conclusions that we could apply to today. But there are some things. Already we're at one. Okay, well, at least I won't get the chance, I won't bother to disclose what I really wanted to say. I'd just like to point out a few things. I think we are at an extraordinary period in history where the past is not a clear determinant of the future, where we're moving into a new phase, and that's to be identified. And I just want to mention a few parts of it very briefly. I think the emergence of the importance of the individual is a phenomenon mostly of the 20th century, even more so of the 21st century, with the empowerment of the internet and all that has come. And the significance which Ishmael Sarageldin pointed out in his opening remarks, that the UN Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 was an unprecedented point in history, marking the importance of the individual, not just of the collective, not just of the society. And the SDGs in Agenda 2030 was an affirmation, confirmation of that in an effort to take it and realize it as an actual fact, which we know we haven't done. But I think we have to be careful not to write off the SDGs or write off the Declaration of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because we see history has these forward and retroactive movements. Clearly, we're not there yet. And just one other point I'll make. If we look at the evolution of society over thousands of years, or the nation state over 100 years, the nation state represented a critical change in the psychology of human beings, that we were no longer identifying our identity because of our ethnic background immediately or necessarily, because of our religion, because of our race. But more and more we were into a phase of heterogeneous age, where our identity was more and more a mix of this thing we called nationality, this obscure concept of nationality. And now we're going beyond the nation state to global society. And the values, the universal values that are now we're attempting to implement, are values that overcome all of the distinctions and differences and affirm a unity and commonality of all human nature, which, as far as we know, has never taken place in history. And I think I'm emphasizing the subjective dimension of what's going on may be a greater determinant of the future than the objective facts and the technology and the institutions that we see around us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Garry. I know this is a very significant topic, and it's really hard to be brief on this because it is so close to home. It has everything to do, as I said earlier, with how we show up in the world, how we view this historical moment. And I just wanted to follow up very briefly on one thing you said. You disclosed that your personal approach to the study of history has been influenced by the study of the spiritual teachings of Sri Aurobindo. And I will say that my approach has also been influenced by the spiritual study of Baha'i spiritual sources. But really, in addition to that, we now have physicists and physical science that has very clearly established the reality of consciousness and the non-locality of consciousness, and that is Nobel science. And what these physicists are saying is that The essence of consciousness is to evolve. Now, we are talking about a very long view perspective, and you're very right that the record of history in the short term is much harder to read. But I think you pointed to some very important factors here. And now we are very grateful to have on this panel two representatives of the Force for Good organization. And as I understand it, Chris and Ketan have discussed with each other who will share what aspects of the thinking of the organization. So we turn first to Chris HANSMEYER, Head of Research at Force for Good, who will highlight for us some more general points on how the organization envisions and works with transforming the current capitalist system towards a secure and sustainable future. Chris, the floor is yours.
Great.
And
thank you.
4 minutes, I'll signal you again.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the World Academy for hosting the conference and this important event. And thank you, Elena, for moderating. You asked a really interesting question up front, or to frame this, which is, what are the forces that we discern? And I think any forces that we discern through the patterns that we see. And the challenge with that is that depending on where and when in history you stand, you see very different patterns. So both Garry and Dr. TUOMIOJA have referenced Francis Fukuyama, who I think was only half joking when he called his paper The End of History, because from his perspective, liberal democracy had come off of an extraordinary 200-year bull run and had just effectively defeated communism to become the dominant way in which societies would organize themselves. Now, if Mr. Fukuyama had been writing in the spring of 1945, I don't think he would have called his paper that, and he wouldn't have written that paper. He probably would have written a paper that he called Cycles of Violence, and he would have looked to explain why it just seems to be that every generation or two, nation states fight each other in increasingly savage wars over the same reasons. So even in that one example, you can see that there are cyclical narratives of history, and there are progressive narratives of history. And I think the force is we're looking at what are the forces that give rise to the appearance of these shapes, right? So I think it's important to state that history obviously doesn't have a goal. It's not goal directed, like evolution isn't either. So it's not determined, but it's not random either, right? History and events play out against a structural and contextual background that is very consistent over time. So structural factors like geography, climate, limitations of human biology, the laws of physics are effectively a constant background against which events unfold. And structural factors like religion or institutions or culture are obviously amenable to change over time, but they're also remarkably persistent, right? So in sciences, if you have an experiment and you rerun it under the same conditions, you should always get the same result. And history obeys those same laws, right? So it turns out that invading Russia from the west with the land army in late summer is a bad idea. And that's been independently verified by Sweden in the 18th century, by France in the 19th, and by the Germans in the 20th century. So you have the emergence of what appear to be cyclical structures in history. But history obviously doesn't repeat itself because there is a force or something that is like a force that drives it forward. And Elena, you called it understanding. I would call it knowledge, right? Knowledge is the one thing in human history that has continuously increased, not in all places, not at the same time, and not always in one direction, but over time. It has been accumulative, it's been accretive, and it's been exponential. And all of the progress that we see in the world, whether it was the population growth that Professor TUOMIOJA referred to, or the organizational complexity, or the universalization of values, all of those ultimately come back to the fact that we as human beings and as societies have been building knowledge over time. And it's that knowledge that enables us to break through these cycles that we see. So if you would have asked somebody 100 years ago about epidemics, they would say, sure, we have them every couple of generations, and they go and wipe out a significant portion of our population. Those don't exist anymore. So I think there's a lot of patterns and examples from history that we can look at as case studies that can explain where we are in the current day. And we need to learn the lessons from those. But, as Professor TUOMIOJA said, we're not prisoners of history because we can use knowledge to both learn the mistakes from history and to come up with new paradigms that break through the structures that have limited us in the past. And I think I'm out of time now, so I'll stop there and hand the floor over to Ketan.
That was wonderful. Thank you so very much. It's amazing how much you were able to say in your 5 minutes. And I would just jump in and reinforce one of the several very important things that you offered us. Cyclical structures appear, but they drive forward. And that is the case in development, in individual and in collective development. There's cycles, cyclical cycles, but they have actually an evolutionary directive. And in this process of moving between cycles, there's always a lot of uncertainty. And we see in development that in this progression, in this developmental progression, some people retreat under the uncertainty and some people push forward. But at the end of the day, there is a direction to this process. So thank you so much. And now we turn to Ketan that will take us into an even more focused look on this question. Please, Ketan. Oh, you're mute.
Thank you very much, Elena. And really, I want to also thank Garry very much for all the fascinating conversations he and I have had. There was one in particular in Mumbai that led us to think about cycles and history and where we are today. I'll begin just by saying I found myself yesterday night after a long day browsing through YouTube to see what was going on in the world. And what you find is a fascinating set of conflicts between individuals in formats where they argue about whose fault it is that there is a conflict. And there is such violence and hatred in these conversations. It made me think our neurology in some ways is designed, usefully designed for survival purposes, but designed to give us a delusional experience that we are a unit that is independent. Independent of the world around us, an independent agent that is empowered to make decisions as if it was a unit of one. And that delusional sense, I think, leads us to assert our egos in ways that are deeply unhelpful and to believe that we are somehow at the end of history in some way as an agent that will act and make a big difference. I want to step right back and say, it also made me think immediately that the cosmic cycle is the universe began 13.8 billion years ago. And, there are so many theories about where it goes next, but there are maybe 4 big pertinent cycles that I want to draw on for where we are today. One is the climate cycle. There are many theories around it, Gaia and Milankovitch and tipping cycles and points. But it essentially says the Earth was stable for 3.5 billion years. Ice ages come every 100,000 years. We're in the Anthropocene now where we're breaching planetary boundaries. All of a sudden, that becomes completely relevant to where we are today. These cycles are meeting and converging on us in a risk of perhaps an irreversible shift in how we behave on the planet. And there are human development cycles, macro ones, big cycles, where we were foragers for a long period, maybe 190,000 years apparently. We were agrarian for maybe 11 to 12,000 years. We were in the industrial age for 200 years. So you see the rate and speed of change. We've been in the information age for about arguably some between 25 and 50 years. Some would argue slightly longer. And it's uncertain where that phase goes next. Because we have the information age has yielded weaponry of a nature that could wipe out the planet, it's possible that there is a collapse now of our civilization and presence on the planet, or that we break through to sustainability. The third I want to point out is the imperial cycle or the great power cycle. And there have been some great thinkers on this. Kaludin, Toynbee, Turchin, Mottl as an analyst, but there's so many great thinkers. And essentially, if you do the maths, which Chris and I recently did in a paper that is about to be published, empires last about 200, 300 years. And there is a cycle to them, a process. That they begin, they peak, and they overreach, and then they collapse. Which leads us to a very pertinent question for today. When will the US hegemonic decline see its ultimate position where it loses significance, where the US loses significance? And then finally, there's cycles of violence where we are in positions of trauma because of things that are done to us or we do to each other or we do to ourselves. And you see this in so many different circumstances, in wars in particular, in torture and ways of conflict and so on. But there is a cycle to that. There's harm, there's trauma, there's retaliation, and it becomes intergenerational. And we get programmed to, in this process, to not break through. And the breakthrough is ultimately required to make a difference to stopping the cycle of violence. And so these are some of the cycles I see as very important for us deciding where we are. And if I draw it all together, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more, and I'm at the end of my 5 minutes, we're in that very special moment where we're about to, in the next 25 years, reach 10 billion people. We're in a hegemonic cycle where American power will no longer be the guiding force of our times. We're in a climate cycle which is existential for us. And even if it doesn't wipe out all of us, it will completely change the structure of how we run ourselves on this planet. And we're in a series of eras, shifts from the industrial era, which built everything we recognize today, to an information and technological shift, which is very profound and will wipe out the basis of our power structures and economics and social interactions to create something very different. And so this is a very important historic time where many cycles are converging. I look forward to discussing what we do about that too in this panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was quite profound. You're leaving us with a lot to try to address in our limited remaining time. Not sure how we're going to do it, but how these cycles are converging now. That's a big question. We turn to our last but not least speaker on the panel, Pavel LUKSHA, who's founder of Global Education Futures Initiatives. And maybe it's appropriate that we turn to an educator to ask how he sees the convergence of these cycles at this time. So, Pavel, from your focus on learning ecosystems and skills for the future, what do you consider important for people to understand about the evolutionary trajectory of history, especially at a time when civilization appears to be eroding? And you're welcome to connect your comments to what Ketan just offered us as a perspective of the converging cycles. Pavel.
Thank you very much, Elena, and thank you, World Academy, for organizing this important panel, which I think is a crucial conversation for us. I will not speak as an educator, but more like a system scientist and evolutionary scholar. And from this perspective, my thinking has been for a long time around bigger cycles of human history, basically taking human history in the perspective that Ketan mentioned, which is the perspective of cosmic evolution and the planetary evolution and evolution of all life. From that perspective, humanity has a history. Let's say if we think of Homo as a species of approximately 2 million years, and as Homo sapiens, which is the wise human, which I doubt we really are so wise, but that's what the name of our species is supposed to mean. That history lasts for approximately the estimated period between 100 and 200,000 years. It is important to say that we increasingly realize that this period of history, most of human history, has not been just, let's say, a peaceful coexistence with planetary systems. In fact, throughout that period, the most period of our human history, we have been expanding as a species, literally proliferating every possible land ecosystem on our planet. So we are the super invasive species, and that maybe points to one of our crucial roles that we could play in some particular direction of the history. Now, approximately 10,000 years ago, the new phase began, which was some societies started to stabilize in certain locations for multiple reasons, including climate change, and perhaps also religious reasons, spiritual reasons. And that led to what we now know as the current form of our existence. And over this time, we started also to evolve our technologies, our material culture. Now, where it took us, on one hand, it took us to create an enormous, what some people call nature 2. I have 1 minute. Okay. So just wrapping up quickly, the nature 2 is now increasingly, the artificial nature is now increasingly becoming autonomous, increasingly becoming independent. From this perspective, we are entering the nexus of crisis. We become a planetary species in the interaction of all living ecosystems. The history of humans can no longer be seen independent, and probably can never be seen independent, but now it certainly cannot be seen independent from the history of biosphere, and and also from the history of technosphere. So we are entering, we are in the midst of one of the most massive crises of our species, the evolutionary crisis, which I think poses ahead of us the question: do we collapse, do we disappear, or do we transcend? And transcending would means finding harmony with both nature 1, the biosphere, and nature 2, the increasingly autonomous technosphere. And that will be the transcendence of our species, which will also require new levels of understanding, knowledge building, and consciousness.
Thank you so much, Pavel. And also thank you to our participants. I don't know if you've had a chance to check, but we have some active contributions on the chat. I'll take the liberty to read one or two. There were a lot of congratulatory remarks for the cogency of what was offered. Special thanks to Ketan, who a participant said has beautifully consolidated all the key points we've been discussing throughout the conference into just 4 or 5 crisp insights. And there is an important recommendation from Bridges, from Dr. Stephen Hartman, who suggests that we should be careful not to impute ultimate meanings to history as a force based on notions of progress that are themselves historically contingent. So, forgive me, there was some movement here. This is not at all to say that we can learn from history, from complete experiments of the past, that, whether intended or unintended, nor does this mean we cannot apply this knowledge, our developing understanding. Yes, I also prefer developing understanding because knowledge does evolve, to the challenges of the present and future. Clearly we can, but not in a deterministic way, nor with the positivistic assurance of the scientific process, principles of empiricism, falsifiability, etc. So that is a very interesting comment to propel us into your final round of very specific thoughts that you'd like to offer. We have 6 minutes to go, dear colleagues. Let's make the best of them. So let's take 1.5 minutes each, if you're comfortable with that, for a closing comment that you'd like to leave us with. Professor TUOMIOJA?
Thank you. Just a point on the knowledge. In addition to knowledge, we have a surplus of information. And whereas we acknowledge that knowledge tends to be true, of course, it can be scientific method that can change our views of what is the objective truth. But information can be false or true. And that is the challenge that we are facing in today's world, is the surplus of and overflow of information, which is being used also on purpose to spread falsehood. And we are living in a time when even the President of the United States can say that, well, facts don't matter, opinions are the only thing that matter. And this is becoming the dominant feature of our discourse today. And therefore, I would stress the need to try to stick to facts as far as possible and real knowledge, because only real knowledge can lead to understanding. We have to follow the information. We have to also be aware of the kind of disinformation that is being spread around. But we have to be able to also work against it, combat it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate this reminder. I grew up in the Marxist experiment, where also there was all kinds of things that were claimed as facts. And so I am very cognizant of the importance of real facts that we can check scientifically and what we're basing our claims on. So very, very grateful for this, Professor TUOMIOJA. Garry, this time I'm going to let you have the closing word. So I'll go to Chris now, Ketan, and then Pavel and yourself. Chris.
Thank you. Yeah, I would just highlight that or reiterate the comment that you read out, right? That progress is an emergent phenomenon, right? It's not a driving force in and of itself. And you know, history is obviously not deterministic as well, right? So we cannot we cannot predict the future that arises from the past. Or you can do, well, you can with predictive data analytics. If you have huge amounts of data, you can make very specific probabilistic statements. But as Professor TUOMIOJA was saying, we have a surplus of information to do that. So the other thing I would say is that progress plays out on time frames that I don't think we can necessarily rely on the future to be better than tomorrow, right? I mean, again, coming back to the progress of liberal democracy, if you were living in 1815 around the Congress of Vienna, right, that all of your adult life would have been spent under a repressive, regressive regime, and it was only in 1848 that you would have seen progress again. So from your perspective, there was no arc. So we need to actively shape the future and cannot wait on emergent phenomenon to make the world a better place.
Thank you. That was really poignant, to the point. Thank you so very much. Ketan.
Thank you. What an interesting discussion that could go on so long. So my brief reflection on what it might take, given the convergence and the forces that are moving us forward or backwards, but moving us today, I would say this, that we are at an unusual point where we have so many tools, so many resources, and so much knowledge that is building solutions. But we are just as inclined, because of our psychology, our genetics, and our environment, to use that to have more conflict, do more conquest. And so the answer must be surely that, I find myself thinking surely that it's a journey inside that allows you to have a deeper understanding of who you are, your place in the world, some understanding of the link and the awareness of your position relative to others, and some experience of compassion that encourages you to interpret the world through that lens, while still understanding that there are others that will be aggressive and likely to want to subjugate you. So it's this tension of compassion for others to create a more meaningful, better world where others can live well, at the same time as protecting yourself from those that would stop you and others doing that. And somehow in that process, we will find a better answer if we're on the journey towards that place of collective consciousness.
So beautiful, so beautiful. Thank you so very much. I guess I'd just like to add that because history is not deterministic, and because of what you just pointed out, each developmental leap takes us to a qualitatively new place, a place of greater compassion, of greater understanding. And it is not predictable. It's qualitatively different than the previous one. So I think we're making some real progress in understanding the dynamics here. Let's have Pavel add his closing words, and then Garry.
Thank you, Elena. And I'd like to answer your question, actually, which is what educators need to do at this point in time. And I think educators have a crucial responsibility. first of all, to bring an understanding that we are planetary species with planetary responsibility, and that we need to cultivate planetary consciousness. So that's one crucial element. And one crucial element of planetary consciousness is learning to live in peace with each other, because global wars are probably the biggest existential threats to us immediately right now. So cultivating peace and cultivating compassion is the basis of our future pathway to transcendence that we're discussing.
Thank you. Thank you. And maybe as an educator, I will add that as we are teaching people that we are a planetary species, we can always offer a lot of historical examples of how many limiting perceptions and frames of reference have been expanded and transcended over time. So that helps keep us on track and keep the horizon more visible. And with that, we come to Garry, who has the horizon to envision this whole event and many other such. And surely, Garry, you have some wisdom with which you can close.
Well, thanks very much for a very stimulating discussion. We've compressed a lot into a short time. Quick responses. Ketan mentioned the convergence of forces and the increasing pressure for change. And I think that's a very important factor. It's not a prediction, but we see that the really dramatic changes that human beings have been capable of have only been under periods when the pressure was so great that we couldn't continue in the way we were. The UN, the founding of the UN came as a result of two horrendous world wars, which we said we've got to do something to prevent this from happening again, as one of many examples of it. I think it's also clear, as Ketan said, that we have so many tools for change today that we have the possibility of doing something different. The whole question is not that. The whole question is whether we'll do it or not. The whole question is not the objective situation that we see. The whole question is subjectively, are we capable of being different than we have been up until now? And is there any evidence that we have been different in the past from what we were in a previous period? I think that's what I was trying to, very shortly, emphasize. The subjective dimension of this, a question of choice. And when one of you mentioned that, I was reminded, and the first time this topic came on the agenda of the Academy, to my knowledge, was in 1999, when we organized in Vancouver a half-day session on social development. And we weren't talking about determinisms. So we finally came up with, and we published a publication at that time called Human Choice. And I think that's where we come back to now. We can't predict from past events or even the threats that we face what's going to happen. This is not a determinism. The determinant is going to be us. And the real power is with us. And as Ketan said, if we have that capacity for compassion, if we have that common sense for our survival, and not just to try to dominate more and more over the other, if we have that capacity to outgrow the egoism of individuality and really find the unity behind our individuality that makes us capable of not being like the people who came before or the way we were before, that we have that choice. I think that's the message for us, that for the Academy, we have a choice. We're not predicting what's going to happen. We're not saying there's a determinism. We are the determinant. It's up to us. And so what do we do about it?
Well, thank you. Thank you. That is a powerful, powerful closing offering. And of course, in our next session, we will be talking exactly about choice, moral choice and motivation. So we continue with a short break. Thank you to all participants. Thank you most of all to this illustrious panel. And we continue for the last panels before the closing of this magnificent conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Thanks for all of you joining.
Thank you.